Wilhelm Keitel spent 12 years signing every single order that Hitler put in front of him, and his colleagues called him Lakeitel, a pun on his name and the German word for lackey, directly to his face, and he kept signing anyway. And when the war ended and they brought him to Nuremberg to answer for what he had done, he sat in that courtroom and genuinely could not understand why he was there, because from his perspective, he had simply been doing his job honestly and loyally for 12 years, and that is what makes his story one of the most uncomfortable stories of the entire Second World War, because the question it asks is this: if a man sincerely believes he is just following orders, does he bear responsibility for what those orders do to other people? And the Nuremberg tribunal answered that question by putting a rope around Keitel's neck in October 1946. And the answer has been the foundation of international law ever since. Keitel was born in September 1882 in Lower Saxony into a landowning family, and his early life was comfortable and unremarkable in every way. Good family, good education, no obvious trauma or damage that historians can point to and say this is where it started. And in 1901 he received his commission in the Imperial German Army and began the kind of steady, quiet career that capable and ambitious staff officers build over decades, accumulating experience and contacts and a reputation for reliable professional performance. And by the time the First World War began in 1914, he was a competent, experienced officer with solid staff training and good prospects. And he served throughout the war in various staff positions and emerged from it in 1918 with his reputation intact despite the German defeat, which was not guaranteed for officers of his generation, given the chaos and humiliation that followed. The years between the wars were the period when the quality that would define Keitel's entire career revealed itself most clearly, and that quality was a remarkable talent for institutional politics, for reading what the people above him wanted and delivering it smoothly and without friction, and in the reduced German military of the Weimar period, where the army was limited by Versailles to 100,000 men, and competition for advancement was fierce, this talent was enormously valuable, because the officers who rose in that environment were not necessarily the most brilliant tacticians, but the ones who were best at navigating the military bureaucracy, and Keitel was very good at this, rising steadily through staff positions and building a reputation as the kind of officer who could be trusted with complex organizational tasks and who would not create unnecessary problems for the people above him. What Keitel was not, and what his colleagues understood increasingly clearly as his career advanced, was an independent strategic thinker, because the same instinct that made him so effective as a staff administrator, his automatic alignment with the views of whoever held authority over him, was precisely what made him unsuitable for the kind of independent judgment that senior command requires, and the officers who knew him best regarded him with a combination of respect for his competence and something close to contempt for his lack of moral and intellectual independence. And this contempt eventually produced the nickname Lakeitel that followed him through the rest of his career. And the fact that this nickname was used openly, even by people who were technically his subordinates, tells you everything about how the German officer corps really saw him, even as they continued to work within the system he ran. The moment that defined the rest of Keitel's life came in 1938, when Hitler reorganized the German military command structure and created the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Armed Forces, as a new organization that would sit above the Army, Navy, and Air Force and serve as Hitler's personal military staff. And Keitel was appointed as its chief, And the reason Hitler chose him is the most revealing thing about the appointment, because Hitler did not choose Keitel for his strategic brilliance, or his combat record, or his ability to give honest professional advice. He chose him because Keitel was exactly the kind of man Hitler wanted in that position, senior enough and experienced enough to give the OKW institutional credibility, but without enough independent judgment or moral courage to push back when Hitler's decisions went against military reality. And Hitler's instinct about Keitel proved completely correct. Because over the following 7 years, Keitel demonstrated again and again that he was simply unable to sustain any position that contradicted Hitler's wishes, and this inability made him simultaneously one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany and one of the most completely empty. The relationship between Hitler and Keitel was one of the stranger psychological dynamics of the entire Nazi period, because it was not a relationship between a strong leader and a loyal subordinate in any normal sense. It was something more like a puppeteer and a puppet, except that the puppet was a field marshal with 40 years of military experience. And the dynamic worked because Keitel genuinely admired Hitler in a way that went beyond professional loyalty, seeing in him the decisive visionary leadership that Keitel himself lacked and had spent his career serving rather than embodying. And Hitler appreciated Keitel's reliability while holding him in a degree of personal contempt he did not bother to hide. And the senior German commanders who dealt with both men watched this dynamic with a mixture of fascination and disgust, because it showed so clearly what happened to a man's judgment and dignity when he decided that his position was worth more than his integrity. The war that began in September 1939 gave Keitel's position a concrete and terrible weight, because the OKW was not just a bureaucratic organization, it was the mechanism through which Hitler's military decisions were turned into orders that the German armed forces actually executed. And Keitel sat at the center of that mechanism for 6 years, and the orders that passed through his hands were not limited to conventional military directives about troop movements and supply logistics. They included some of the most criminal orders ever issued by any military organization in the history of warfare. And Keitel signed them all, and this is the fact about his career that towers over everything else. The most notorious of these orders was the Commissar Order issued in June 1941, before the invasion of the Soviet Union, which directed German forces to execute all captured Soviet political commissars immediately rather than treating them as prisoners of war, a direct and deliberate violation of the laws of war, and several senior German commanders objected to this order on both legal and practical grounds. And Keitel knew about these objections and dismissed them, and signed the order, and made sure it was distributed to the relevant commands. And the Commissar Order resulted in the systematic murder of thousands of Soviet prisoners in the months that followed, and set the tone for the entire Eastern Front campaign, which became one of the most brutal and criminal military operations in modern history. Then there was the Night and Fog Decree of December 1941, which directed that civilians in occupied Western Europe suspected of resistance activities should be arrested secretly and transported to Germany without any notification to their families and without any official record of what had happened to them. People who simply vanished into the Nazi security apparatus and were never heard from again. And the deliberate cruelty of leaving families in permanent uncertainty about the fate of their relatives was not an accidental byproduct of the decree. It was part of its design, and Keitel signed it and added a cover note explaining its rationale that made clear he understood exactly what it meant and approved of it completely. And then there was the Commando Order of October 1942, which directed that Allied Special Forces soldiers captured behind German lines should be executed immediately, even if they were in uniform and had surrendered, another straightforward violation of the Geneva Convention. And some German commanders refused to implement this order and testified to that effect at Nuremberg. And Keitel signed it and distributed it, and when confronted with it at his trial, offered the same defense he offered for every criminal order his signature appeared on, which was that he had been following Hitler's instructions, and the tribunal rejected this defense as completely as it is possible to reject a legal argument. The picture that emerges from Keitel's wartime record is of a man who was present at the center of the German military command for 6 years, who was aware of the criminal nature of many of the orders he was signing, who received objections from subordinates who had more moral courage than he did, and who signed the orders anyway, not because he was driven by fanaticism or sadism, but because he had made a decision, consciously or not, that his position and his relationship with Hitler were worth more than his integrity or the lives of the people who would die as a result of the orders he was putting his name to. And this decision, repeated over and over across 6 years of war, accumulated into a record of complicity that was comprehensive and well documented, and that left him with essentially nothing to stand on when the accounting finally came. The other senior German commanders have left detailed accounts of their frustrations with Keitel, and these accounts are remarkably consistent, painting the picture of a man who would agree with whatever Hitler said in Hitler's presence, and then prove incapable of holding any contrary position when challenged. And Field Marshal Manstein, who was probably the best strategic mind in the German military, described Keitel as a man who had completely surrendered his professional judgment to his personal loyalty to Hitler. And General Halder, who served as Army Chief of Staff in the early years of the war, was even blunter, writing after the war that Keitel had been a catastrophic influence on German military decision-making because his inability to give Hitler honest professional advice meant that Hitler was operating without the kind of reality check that any commander needs. And the disasters of the Eastern Front were in part the consequences of a command culture where the man with the most direct access to Hitler was constitutionally incapable of telling him he was wrong. As the war turned against Germany through 1943 and 1944, Keitel's role became less about providing military advice and more about translating Hitler's increasingly disconnected directives into orders that field commanders were supposed to execute. And the field commanders knew better than anyone how impossible these orders were and said so. And Keitel's job was essentially to absorb this feedback without letting it reach Hitler and make sure the orders went out anyway. And he performed this function with the same reliable efficiency he had always brought to his work, right up until the very end, when the end came fast and completely. In April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin and the Nazi state collapsed around what remained of its leadership, Keitel spent the final weeks issuing orders to armies that no longer existed and relaying Hitler's directives to commanders who were doing their best to surrender their forces before they were completely destroyed. And on the 8th of May, 1945, he performed the last official act of his career, signing the German instrument of unconditional surrender on behalf of the German armed forces. And the photographs from that ceremony show Keitel in full uniform with his field marshal's baton, conducting himself with the formal military bearing he had maintained throughout his career. And there is something almost unbearable about those images, because this is a man who spent 6 years helping to run a war that killed tens of millions of people, now signing the document that confirmed it had all ended in total defeat. He was arrested shortly after and transferred to Nuremberg, where he was indicted on all 4 counts: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the trial that followed was in many ways the most straightforward of all the major Nuremberg prosecutions, because the documentary evidence against Keitel was overwhelming and consisted largely of documents he had signed himself, and his defense was that he had been following Hitler's orders, and that as a soldier his duty was obedience rather than independent moral judgment. And the tribunal's rejection of this defense was clear and complete, because the court held that there are limits to the defense of superior orders, that an officer who signs directives ordering the murder of prisoners of war and civilians cannot escape responsibility simply by pointing to the man who told him to sign them, and that Keitel's seniority and his access to information about the criminal nature of the orders he was implementing made his responsibility greater rather than smaller. What stands out about Keitel during the trial is how genuinely he seemed unable to understand why his defense was not being accepted, because within the framework of values he had operated under his entire career, loyalty and obedience to legitimate authority were the highest military virtues, and the idea that there could be orders so criminal that a soldier's duty was to refuse them was genuinely foreign to his understanding of what military service meant. And this is not an excuse for what he did, but it is an explanation, because Keitel was the product of a military culture that had elevated obedience to the point where it had become a substitute for moral judgment, rather than a complement to it. And the Nazi system had taken that culture and used it to commit crimes on a scale that its original designers could not have conceived. He was convicted on all 4 counts and sentenced to death, and his request to be shot rather than hanged, on the grounds that hanging was a criminal's death while a firing squad was a soldier's death, was denied. And on the 16th of October, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was hanged at Nuremberg alongside 9 other convicted Nazi war criminals, and he was 64 years old, and his last words were that he had been a loyal soldier who had done his duty, which was entirely consistent with everything he had believed and said throughout his life and his trial, and which contains within it the entire tragedy of his story, because the question his life poses is whether a man who sincerely believes he is doing his duty bears the same responsibility for the consequences as a man who acts from conscious malice. And Nuremberg answered that question one way, and Keitel answered it another way, and the rope settled the argument. The principle that Nuremberg established through Keitel's case, that following orders is not a complete defense against charges of war crimes, became one of the foundations of international humanitarian law, and was incorporated into the Geneva Conventions and subsequent international legal instruments. And this principle exists in large part because of men like Keitel, because the scale of what the Nazi military did made it impossible to accept that the people who implemented those crimes bore no personal responsibility simply because someone above them had given the order. The story of Wilhelm Keitel is the story of what happens when a man decides that his career and his position matter more than his judgment and his conscience, because Keitel was not stupid and he was not ignorant, and he had enough professional knowledge to understand that many of the orders he was signing were criminal, and the colleagues who knew him confirmed that he understood this and signed anyway. And the price of that decision was paid not just by Keitel at the end of a rope in Nuremberg, but by the thousands of Soviet commissars executed under the Commissar Order, the civilians who vanished under the night and fog decree, the Allied soldiers murdered under the Commando Order, and the countless others whose deaths passed through the machinery that Keitel kept running with such professional reliability, and all of them paid a price for his choice. And he paid it last, and he paid it once, and they paid it first, and they paid it forever. And that is the final judgment on the man they called Lakeitel,